Hi, everybody. As you all are well aware by now, here at the beginning of this semester, this endeavor that we're working through that we call the humanities is about the big questions. Questions like, what does it mean to be human? Who is God? Who are we? What is life all about? What is death all about? Well, I'm going to start off today with a big question that maybe we don't always think of as a big question, or at least it doesn't seem like one of those ponderous, weighty questions that keeps us up at night. And that's simply the question of what is funny to you? What's the funniest thing you've ever seen or heard? When you think about humor, what comes to mind? Now, in my own life, when I think about that question, it strikes me that it's a little bit of a moving target. So my answer to that question might not necessarily change every day, but it does change with each season of my life. If we could go back several decades and ask the 9-year-old version of me what the answer to that question would be, I would probably tell you that the funniest movie ever made, in fact, the funniest movie that ever would be made, was a film called Spaceballs. It was a parody, a spoof of the Star Wars films by Mel Brooks. Now, this movie had it all. It had a character named Pizza the Hutt. It had a Darth Vader stand-in called Lord Dark Helmet, and it was filled with jokes that kept a third grader in stitches. Well, over time, my opinions about Spaceballs changed, and I started to find other things that were even more humorous than this cinematic masterpiece. So, for instance, I discovered Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and the Far Side comics, and David Letterman top 10 lists, and Late Night with Conan O'Brien, and Arrested Development, and The Onion, and on and on. And at each juncture in my life, as my sense of humor changed, I might have pointed to any one of these things as the funniest thing currently in existence. There's a reason that we call dad jokes, because our sense of what is funny changes depending on where we are in life, depending on what our experiences and perspectives might be. Well, I think that what is true for us as individuals, as third graders, or as dads, is also true for cultures or societies or periods of history. Humor, like so many other things that depend on taste, varies. It changes, it morphs, it develops. It ebbs and flows, so that at various points in our history, various brands of comedy and various types of jokes become paramount to our discussion of what humor is all about. And that brings us to another big question that's bound up with this, and that's the question of what is humor for? What can humor do? What is humor capable of? Again, our answers to this are likely going to vary depending on our experiences or on our station in life, or maybe just on our mood. Does humor exist solely to make us feel good? Like when you've had a hard day and you just want to kind of unwind with an episode of The Office or Friends or some other comedy that gives you comfort, that dispenses the therapeutic gift of laughter. Or maybe you believe that the chief end of humor is about building relationships, telling jokes, sharing funny stories, maybe circulating funny memes. These are things that bond us to other people. Or maybe you think humor has the capacity to actually change things, to make us think, to provoke ideas, to upset the status quo in some way. Does humor serve a purpose beyond what is immediately evident? And that brings us to our topic for today, satire. When we think about the possibilities of humor, when we think about the capacity of comedy to go beyond the laughter, to achieve some greater end, there are lots of ideas or categories that we might turn to, but satire has been one of the most enduring. And in some ways, the idea of satire has been one of the toughest to pin down because of its versatility, because of the way that it draws in all sorts of different voices with different perspectives and different goals, and because of the way that it elicits all sorts of responses. One thing that can be agreed on is that if comedy or humor develops in different ways or in different contexts at different points in history, it could certainly be said that we are currently living in an age of satire, an age in which so much of our humor could be labeled as satirical. It could also be said, and in fact it has been said, that the 18th century, the period that we're studying here at the beginning of Humanities 201, was also an age in which satire thrived, where the sort of wit and comedy that was on display had this satirical edge to it. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're going to talk about the nature and uses of satire. As we get into the first couple weeks of class, you're going to be looking at some works in your section that engage in satire masterfully. And so it might help to start, as we often do, with a definition, something that can give us a common frame of reference so that we're all speaking the same language when it comes to this idea of satire. So, for a quick working definition, we can consult the Oxford English Dictionary, which has this to say about what satire is. It says that satire is art that uses humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize prevailing immorality or foolishness, especially as a form of social or political commentary. And that last part, that italicized part, as you probably guessed, is pretty important. I think that sometimes, especially maybe in the world of social media, the word satire gets overused, as if every joke is satirical. But that's not the case. There are lots of different types of humor that wouldn't be labeled as satire. There are even lots of types of humor that use exaggeration or ridicule or irony that aren't necessarily satire. For something to be truly satirical, it has to be pointed. That is, it has to tend in the direction of exposing or criticizing something or someone, usually some powerful or prominent figure or institution or tendency. In other words, satire might or might not make us laugh. Usually it will, but it won't always. But it always has to make us think. It has to make us think about the way things are, but also it might make us think about the way things could be, the way things might be different. And that brings us to a second point about satire. See, as a form of humor, satire is not necessarily a genre. Unlike some of the other genres that you've studied in humanities, from the epic poem to the Greek tragedy to the Arthurian romance, satire isn't as much about formal conventions or about technical qualities. And it's more about an approach. And this led one 20th century critic to remark that satire is the most problematic mode of literature because it appears never to correspond to any one kind. I think that it's fitting that the word itself comes from the Latin term satura, which means a table full of mixed fruits and nuts. Because satire is not even restricted to a certain field of artistic expression. You might encounter satire in novels and in paintings and in poetry and in drama and in TV shows and movies or any other kind of artistic expression. At its heart, satire is less a genre and it's more of a mood or a tone that might be applied to all sorts of artistic expression. The kind of artistic expression that seeks to confront tough questions and that seeks to wrestle with the tough realities that the artist wants to present. So, why might an artist choose to work in this mode? What makes satire such an important tool for the kind of criticism that satirists seek to present? And I think that one of the reasons that this mode, the satirical mode, has been such a useful implement of artistic critique from ancient times all the way to the present is because it allows an artist or a storyteller to say something that they might not otherwise be able to say. See, humor has a way of disarming the listener. Exaggeration and irony have a way of catching a listener off guard. A message that is presented with a comic edge can be just ambiguous enough that the powers and authorities who are being skewered might wonder, is he really talking about me? No, surely he's talking about someone else. Jonathan Swift, and we'll talk more about him later, once remarked that satire is a sort of glass or a mirror in which beholders see everyone's face but their own. So it holds up a reflection of the negative tendencies that we might have. But many times the person who it's targeted at might not get the joke, and it's up to others to be able to hear and understand the critique. And so satire is, in a sense, a way of making an important point without getting into too much trouble. Although, as we'll see, some satirists, both past and present, do manage to get themselves in trouble. So we can see forms of satire all the way back to some of the earliest forms of written communication. We can see satire even in the Bible. Some scholars think that the book of Jonah has a satirical message. Of course, we can look at the parables of Jesus in which he used humorous, exaggerated turns of phrase, conjuring up images of planks in people's eyes to critique the judgmental, and camels going through the eyes of needles to critique the practice of amassing wealth, and stories about blind guides leading other people into ditches that Jesus used to critique the Pharisees. All of these images, all of these stories that Jesus told have some kind of satirical edge to them. Writing some 1700 years after Jesus, Jonathan Swift said, "The reason why I write satire is because I cannot destroy all those who deserve it." And yet, as Swift and others have demonstrated, even when it's subtle, satire can be remarkably effective. It can be a remarkably powerful tool to wield against those with power and influence as a means of saying what might not otherwise be said. So what I want to do for the rest of the time that we have together is to break down some main modes of satire that we encounter in the 18th century, as well as in other periods of artistic expression, and then look primarily at the two great satirists writing in English during the 18th century, both of whom will be reading together in class. And then finally, we'll reflect very briefly on how satire continues to contribute and shape our forms of expression even today. So while satire, this table filled with mixed fruits and nuts, takes on many different varieties, we see it at work in all kinds of areas of society throughout history. In fact, when we want to look at satire, even the kinds of satire that were most at work in the 18th century, we want to go back even a little further than that. We want to start with ancient Rome. Because while it could certainly be said that the 18th century was a high point of satire, at least in English, the later days of the Roman Republic and the early days of the Roman Empire were also a time period that was rife with this kind of humorous, pointed, satirical expression. So the first type of satire that we're going to look at today is called Horatian satire. And this is named after the Roman poet Horace, who lived from 65 BC to 8 BC. If you recognize those dates, if you can think back to Humanities 101, you might remember that he's coming of age during the time of Julius Caesar and he's living into the reign of Caesar Augustus. And if you can remember back to Humanities 101, you might remember that this was a time of great political turmoil. It was a time of great social upheaval. Horace was one of the leading poets of that time, but he was also exceedingly popular into the Middle Ages and even into the early modern period. You might remember Horace from Dante's Inferno. He was one of the poets that Dante met in Limbo, that first circle of hell where Dante was hanging out with Homer and Virgil and other poets. Well, Horace was part of that circle as well. Horace wrote all kinds of poetry, but he is most known for his often funny and always insightful satire. And the tone that he employed in this satire is often what we'll call Horatian, was often seen as somewhat playful. The main characteristic of Horatian satire is that it adopts a more amused and tolerant stance towards the objects of criticism. As one critic named Dustin Griffin notes, Horace was more oblique than blunt. He was smiling and hinting rather than attacking directly. And so the Horatian mode is often called smiling satire. Now, this isn't to say that Horatian satire doesn't criticize. It wouldn't be satire if it didn't offer some kind of pointed critique. But when the Horatian satirist speaks about some way that people are failing, or he talks about some standard that they're not living up to, this is done in a more good-natured way, even in a way that indicates that the speaker and the audience are in this together. It's more of a critique that points the finger at us rather than just pointing the finger at you. This is a way of approaching critique that says we are the problem rather than just saying you are the problem. And so Horatian satire, because of this kind of inclusive nature, also leaves open the question, how might we address this? How might we live in a different way or change our behaviors so that we more fully live into the standards set out for us? Now let's look at an example of how this plays out in Horace by looking at a brief passage from his book, aptly titled Satires. In this excerpt, Horace writes to an interlocutor named Maecenas. He says, "How come, Maecenas, no one alive is ever content with the lot he chose or the one fate threw in his way, but praises those who pursue some alternative track. O fortunate tradesman, the aging soldier cries, body shattered by harsh service, bowed by the years. The merchant, however, ship tossed by a southern gale, says soldiering is better. And why? You charge, and then it's a quick death in a moment, or a joyful victory won. When a client knocks hard on his door before cockcrow, the adept in justice and law praises the farmer's life, while he, going bail and having been dragged up to town from the country, proclaims only town dwellers happy. And so what Horace is talking about here is our tendency to look at other people and just assume that they have it better than us, right? The soldier thinks that the businessman, the tradesman has it better. The tradesman at the same time thinks that the soldier has a better life than him. The farmer thinks that the lawyer has it better, and the lawyer thinks that the farmer has it better. Now, why does this work? Why is it funny? Because it says something about us that all human beings can sort of agree on. It speaks to some quirk, it speaks to some character flaw that, if we're honest, we all see in ourselves. We're in on the joke, we're in on the critique. And because it makes us laugh, it also makes us want to change, or at least it makes us think about wanting to change. Now, the second mode of satire that we find in ancient Rome, which makes its way into later periods as well, is called Juvenalian satire. Now, the poet Juvenal lived from about 55 AD to about 127 AD. So he came of age and he produced his work under the reign of a series of Roman emperors. And he had a lot to say about Rome during this period, particularly about the corruption and the vice and the moral depravity that he saw everywhere around him. And he didn't hold back. In fact, the main characteristic of Juvenalian satire is a tendency not to hold back. If Horatian satire is smiling, Juvenalian satire is snarling. If Horatian satire is amused and tolerant, Juvenalian satire is bitter and sharp. If Horatian satire is meant to make you laugh, both at yourselves and others, the Juvenalian satirist is meaning to make you angry, to provoke outrage. This kind of satire, rather than bringing you in on the joke, rather than including him or herself in the critique, adopts a more distant stance, a more aloof stance toward their targets, and then unloads their bitter diatribes from a superior position. Finally, Juvenalian satire is much more negative in the sense that it really doesn't offer some constructive way forward. It doesn't offer some norm to live up to. It's content simply to critique bitingly the state of affairs that exists. So here's an example from Juvenal's work, a couple of excerpts from a passage entitled Bad Parenting. So here's what Juvenal has to say about bad parenting. He says, there is so much, Fushinus, that's displayed and passed on to children by their parents, which merits condemnation and tarnishes the brightness of things with its lasting stain. If the old man ruins himself gambling, his heir, while still a child, plays too, his little cup armed with the same dice. A little bit later, he says, is Rudolus, when he enjoys the savage sound of a flogging and thinks the lash sings sweeter than any siren, when he's a Polyphemus and Antiphates to his fearful home, only happy if the torturer's been called, and someone's feeling the hot iron for a pair of towels? Is he teaching mildness of spirit, or how to rise above minor errors, or that he recognizes the minds and bodies of slaves are of the same substance, the same elements as ours? So we can see what Juvenal is doing here. He's giving his readers images of how the examples of parents lead to the formation of their children. The picture of a little kid gambling, or of a child watching as his father beats the slaves and learns cruelty in the process. These images are meant to make us mad. Whether we think they're funny or not, the real point is the outrage. When we read it, we don't just feel amused, we're also, or even primarily, supposed to feel angry. It's a sort of cathartic way to get our anger or our heartbreak out in the open, whether any real solution is on the horizon or not. So that brings us to the 18th century. And this is the period that we're going to be reading and studying in Humanities 201. And as I've said, this was an age of reason, it was an age of revolution, and fittingly, it was an age of satire. And a number of the works that you're going to be reading will have a sort of satirical edge to them. And it'll be fun talking about these in class and maybe thinking about the moods and the modes that these satirists are using, whether they're more Horatian or more Juvenalian or some mixture of the two. Today, I want to talk briefly about two masters of satire in the 18th century, both of whom were writing in English and both of whom you're going to be reading in class. And this is Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift. So Alexander Pope was born in 1688. He lived until 1744. So he's writing in the first half of the 18th century. And if you learn much about Pope's life, you would probably acknowledge that he had a lot of reasons to be angry at the world around him. He was a Catholic living in England at a time when Catholics didn't have many rights. In fact, Pope didn't even get to attend school because of his religious background. So he was largely self-taught, but he was brilliant. He learned several languages. He devoured the classics, especially Homer. Adding to this, Pope had a number of health problems, which affected his spine and stunted his growth and gave him violent headaches for much of his life. So I think we would understand if Pope was a bitter, angry poet. But while he was an expert in satire, the mode that he most often worked in was that smiling mode, the Horatian mode. You're going to read from one of his works, an essay on man. And among the other numerous poems he wrote, maybe the most famous is called The Rape of the Lock. Now, the word rape here is used to mean seizing or kidnapping. And the word lock here refers to a lock of hair. So maybe the title itself clues you in a little bit to what the plot of this poem is going to be, but also to the nature of the satire. In this poem, Pope constructs what we would call a mock epic. He uses an elevated tone, complete with an invocation of the muses. He develops this highly elevated poem in the heroic couplet, a kind of iambic pentameter approach that is very elevated and very lofty. And all of this is in the service of a poem about a rude partygoer who steals a lock of a woman's hair. And what makes this funny, what makes it poignant, is the way that Pope adapts a style that is usually reserved for talking about things like the Trojan War, but he applies it to this description of an incident at a party. It gives him a chance to poke fun at the social customs of his time and at the ways that people invested so much energy into looking a certain way and entertaining themselves in a certain way and thinking about everything that others might be thinking about them. So in the opening canto of the poem, Pope writes the following. And now unveiled the toilet stands displayed, each silver vase in mystic order laid. First, robed in white, the nymph intent adores with head uncovered the cosmetic powers. A heavenly image in the glass appears. To that she bends, to that her eyes she rears. The inferior priestess at her altar's side, trembling, begins the sacred rites of pride. Unnumbered treasures ope at once, and here the various offerings of the world appear. From each she nicely culls with curious toil, and decks the goddess with the glittering spoil. Now, it sounds like Pope is talking about some religious ritual here, but he's really just describing a young woman named Belinda putting on her makeup and getting her hair ready as she prepares for a social gathering. And it's this elevated style that makes the central conflict of the poem effective. When the Baron at the party takes some scissors and he snips off a lock of Belinda's hair, it's described in the poem as though Helen of Troy were being abducted. So we can see what Pope is doing here. He's poking fun at our tendency to blow things out of proportion. But throughout this, he doesn't fall into the trap of despising his characters. We are led to believe that Belinda truly is hurt by this violation. And we can even understand as we read why she would be hurt. The relative triviality of the Baron's action notwithstanding. Pope is able to critique, but he does so in a smiling, gentle, and even tolerant way, the social customs of his time, customs that he himself participated in. So we can see Pope laughing at himself, even as he laughs at those around him. As you read an essay on man for Monday, I believe, be on the lookout for that tone that Pope adopts. Now, whatever else might be said about our second satirist, Jonathan Swift, very few people would ever call him gentle or tolerant. His work is quite funny at times, and his critiques are usually insightful, but they're very often done so in a bitter, caustic, and even mean-spirited way. T.S. Eliot called Swift a master of disgust. And what was true of Swift's writing was, at least by some accounts, true in his personal life as well. Jonathan Swift was the sort of guy who didn't have much of a filter. If he thought you were doing something wrong, if he had some critique of you, you were likely to hear about it at a dinner party or anywhere else. He wasn't likely to keep it to himself. Um, this might surprise you, given that one of Swift's primary vocations in life was that he served as a minister for most of his career. He was the dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, among other positions. But whatever the case, many scholars agree that Jonathan Swift was the most prominent and accomplished satirist of his time. He was someone who was always training his critical eye and his razor sharp words against the hypocrisy that he saw in politics and religion and the social structures of his day. You're going to be reading for, I think, Wednesday, you're going to be reading one of his works, A Modest Proposal. He also wrote The Battle of the Books, but one of the things that he's probably best known for, and what you may know him for, is his most famous work, Gulliver's Travels, which is one of those books that many of us encounter when we're kids, at least in Disneyfied versions of it, way before we're maybe ready to digest the commentary that's found there. And if there's any part of Gulliver's Travels that you may know, it's probably the journey that Gulliver, the hero and adventurer, makes to the land of Lilliput. And in Lilliput, the people who live there are about 6 inches tall. So this makes for the stuff of a good kids movie. But what you might have missed, or at least I missed it when I was a kid and watched this on the Disney Channel, was how this story, like all the stories in Gulliver's Travels, offer up some pointed and at times very nasty criticism of the world of Swift's time. See, the Lilliputians, the residents of Lilliput, aren't just small in stature, they're also small-minded. They're petty. They go to war with a neighboring land called Blefuscu over what they think is a really important matter. They're fighting this war over the question of whether you break an egg on the big side or the smaller side. And in the story, this has led to years of armed conflict between these two groups. And with this, Swift was criticizing the tendencies in his own time of Catholics and Protestants to go to war over seemingly petty differences. This book is full of all kinds of these critiques. As Gulliver travels to different lands, it gives Swift an opportunity to lambaste the principles of the Enlightenment and problems that he has with science and education and the overall moral depravity of human beings. And it culminates in the last part of the novel where he visits the land of the Houyhnhnms, which are very cultured and dignified horses. And they live alongside a group of people called the Yahoos, which are human-like beasts who are looked upon as mindless savages by the Houyhnhnms. And this chapter, like so much in the book, gives Swift an opportunity to comment on the flaws that he sees in human nature. The implication here is that human beings are not even as morally developed as horses. And while this critique is undeniably funny, it's also undeniably harsh. And while we don't read Gulliver's Travels in Humanities, you'll notice this harsh kind of critique, this harsh kind of satire in the work you do read, A Modest Proposal. So as you're reading, see if you can detect what it is that Swift is critiquing, what the targets of his satire might be. So by now, it might be obvious to you that satire isn't dead. In fact, I would say that it might be the dominant mode of humor that we have today, and we see both Horatian and Juvenalian satire represented, along with other shades and moods. We might see the good-natured Horatian satire in shows like The Office and Parks and Recreation. We see it in stand-up comedy and late-night sketch shows. We see it in both its Horatian and Juvenalian modes in a spate of recent TV programs from Succession and Silicon Valley, which critique business and the tech industry, to the show Veep, which satirizes the political landscape, to The Righteous Gemstones, which targets excesses and hypocrisy in the church. We've got all of these modes of satire at work in our current entertainment. We even see it in the memes that we circulate online. But I hope you realize that satire isn't anything new. Back in ancient times, through the 18th century and to today, wherever there is a target for critique in our world or in ourselves, Satire will be there to make us laugh. But beyond that, satire will be there to make us think. Thank you for your attention.